Dr. Wade Davis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's totally wonderful to see all of you here. A lot of Royal Roads faculty and staff and associate faculty, and have Jerry Kelly come is quite wonderful. And just learned recently that Jerry taught Wade in grades 6 and 7 at Lower Canada College.
I thought he was going to make me do push-ups up
he was
here.
already talking about doing handstands with his toes pointing straight up, so we can.
You used to, as soon as I saw him, I flashed back to grade 7, and this incredibly athletic, buff guy that terrorized us.
So, and for other guests to the university, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here, and it's wonderful for Wade to come. And we just thought, rather than having Wade give a stand-up presentation, we try to engage in a bit more of a conversation. I'll ask him questions that are of interest to me. Hopefully they'll be of interest to you, and then we'll have time, and I've got my watch here to watch the time. There'll be the last half hour, say from 3:30 or so, for you to ask questions, and we'll have someone with a microphone, I hope, to be able to wander around. We are recording the event today, and it'll be broadcast it's being live broadcast, and it'll be available to our students, and I imagine to anyone who can figure out the link, so you can send it to your children or whatever far away. And so, starting with children and childhood, I wondered, if Wade really, when he was a young man, maybe in the care of guys like Jerry Kelly, did he dream about being an explorer in residence? Was that really what you were dreaming about as a child, that straight ahead to National Geo?
No, I think one of the greatest misconceptions we present to students is that life is linear, that you go from A to B to C to D, and if you miss E and D and E, you'll never get to the rest of the alphabet. Anyone who's lived a long life recognizes that life is made of all these serendipitous moments, these crossroads, and what you want to cultivate in a student in particular is the capacity for that girl or boy not to look over their shoulder to their peers, to their teachers, even to their parents, but to cultivate some kind of inner compass so that they make those decisions. And they may not know what they want to do, but if you encourage them not to compromise, in the end they end up building up their own life. And the greatest challenge in life, in fact, the most creative thing you can possibly do in life, is not to write a book or make a film, but become the architect of your own life, so that, when you look back at the age that I'm at now at 58, you may not have made all the right choices, but you made the choices. And so bitterness tends to come to those in old age who look back on a life of choices imposed upon them. So I think the most important thing to do to students is to really encourage them to recognize that they will have these moments of opportunity. And I always say to students, you should really always be an opportunist, not in the sense of being a schemer, but work your life to put yourself in the way of opportunities. Because the way that one grows is by placing yourself into situations where failure is not an option. Success is the only conceivable outcome. And when you get yourself into that kind of space, whether it's by jumping off a cliff metaphorically or taking on an assignment that was beyond your imaginings, you find yourself suddenly entering realms of achievement that would have seemed inconceivable, impossible to you but a few months before. So definitely not.
So what did you dream about when you were a kid? What did you think Wade Davis is going to be when he grows up?
I still don't think in those terms. I still don't actually know what I'm going to do when I grow up. I mean, I've never thought in those terms. Sounds maybe disingenuous to say.
Okay.
I've never made a single decision based on career, money, or anything. I've always just followed my instincts and my heart. I can say that growing up, I think in Montreal was very. Growing up Canadian was hugely important, and because my family was from the West, and I was fortunate to grow up in Montreal, I think I got kind of both poles of our national identity. And I was asked when I did the Massey lectures, why did you become an anthropologist? And I never really thought about it, but I do think growing up in Quebec when I did, which was of course in the early 1960s, when the country was really, the society was still really much the society of the famous Two Solitudes. Mm-hmm. And I lived in a community called Point Clare, which was an English suburb plunked like a carbuncle on the back of an old traditional Francophone community that went back to the 17th century. And there literally was a dividing line between the world of the English and the world of the French called Quartier Boulevard. And there was a little grocery store on that corner that my mother would send me to at the age of 5 to get cigarettes or milk or whatever she wanted. And I was always enchanted that I was on the edge of the unknown, that if I crossed that street, there was a different language, a different religion, a different way of being. And I was fascinated by that and equally fascinated by the subtle prohibition, not from my family, but from my society, that prevented me from crossing that line. And then fortunately, I had this incredibly wild older sister who shattered that line by falling in love with a Francophone boy. And in the wake of her shattering that line, I slipped through in the flotsam and ended up hanging out. And you'd love this story because he was a Mountie. And I actually grew up as a little boy of 5 doing pull-ups on his bicep. I mean, and so I think I grew up very much with this wonderful sense of this world of Quebec. So my heroes growing up were actually Radisson and Groseilliers and all the fur traders who broke open the continent. And I used to sit on the edge of the St. Lawrence River and dream of paddling a canoe across Canada. So that probably, and then also when I had wonderful parents, and when I say wonderful, my father ended up spending half of his savings to send me to Harvard, knowing full well that every day I spent in Cambridge widened the gap between us. And when I was 14, both my parents decided that Spanish was a language of the future, and they sent me off to, do you remember Mr. Forrester at LCC? He's this really interesting guy. I mean, we were at LCC, Lower Canada College. It was kind of this sort of, very much a sort of a man's school and everything. And there was this diminutive man who trailed a scent of cologne that gave him the fey appearance of a dandy. He taught Spanish and French, but that was betrayed by the scar across his face, which revealed a body blown apart in the war. Remember? And he had been in the Merchant Marine, had been sunk on the Atlantic. And he was this sort of flash of unusual inspiration. And he took 6 of us to Columbia in 1968, all boys from LCC. Most of them were 16, I was 14. They were billeted out for the most part with rich families in the streets of Cali, and they spent most of their time in the country club. I was fortunate to be billeted with a more modest family way up in the mountains, and I never saw the other Canadian boys. And many of them were famously homesick, and I, by contrast, felt I'd finally found home. And all the other boys, the parents of all these, had these Canadian boys, kept saying, why can't they be more like little Guillermo? Because I kissed my first girl, I got drunk for the first time, and I was in paradise. And I fell in love with Latin culture, and that's a love that never left me.
Wow. The image in St. Clare of having the being at the edge of the unknown, that seems to be, that's a powerful message for the whole rest of what you did.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I love about anthropology is, if you think about it, the fascinating thing about anthropology is that all human populations share the same adaptive imperatives. We all have children. We must find ways to come together to couple consistently. We must find ways to educate those kids. We must deal with our elderly. We all must deal with the inexorable separation that death represents. And of course, religion is born of that mystery. But given that sort of commonality, the human imagination has flared in so many ways on the frontier of the human spirit to create all these diverse forms of life. Yet cross-cutting that is a wonderful revelation of genetics, which in the last 20 years alone has finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always dreamt to be true, and that is that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally studies of the Y chromosome in the male descent line of humanity and mitochondrial DNA in the female line have left no doubt whatsoever that the human genetic endowment is a single continuum. Race has been exposed as an utter fiction. We're all not only cut from the same genetic cloth, we're all descendant from the same handful of people who walked out of Africa 60,000 years ago and then embarked on this extraordinary hijira, 2,500 generations, 40,000 years that carried the human spirit to every corner of the world. But if you accept that, you have to also accept the corollary, which is that if we all are cut from the same genetic cloth, we all share the same raw mental acuity, the same basic human genius. And here's a critical thing. How that genius is expressed is simply a matter of choice, adaptive imperative. And so what this really means is that there is no ladder of success in culture. There's no progression in the affairs of culture. The other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you or failed attempts at being modern. They are, by definition, unique answers to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And those voices collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the ensuing millennia. So I got that idea very, very early in life. And what I love about anthropology is that, you know, I love the dance of culture. I mean, if you think of what anthropologists are supposed to do, you know, you turn up at some longhouse in the Northwest Amazon, you announce that you're here for 6 months and you're going to feed me and house me, and by the way, I'm here to study your sex life. I mean, if someone turned up at your doorstep in Canada like that, you'd call the police. So you've got to find that right rhythm to break down that inherent barrier that exists between yourself and the people with whom you find yourself living as a guest. And of course, it's never bravado. It's always empathy and love. And this is what I find so incredibly gratifying about doing ethnographic research. And I'm sure all of you feel the same thing. You know, anthropology at some level is just a fancy term for sophisticated travelers. I mean, all we are is just travelers on the go, trying to understand where we are. And I know all of you as travelers have had that same wonderful moment of kind of heartfelt connection with some stranger in some unusual part of the world that is so satisfying. And that reaffirms our sense of universal decency and kindness and so on.
Yeah, and that step into the unknown, you go there and only to find out it's not that weird at all.
No,
but you have to have the confidence to be able to take that step, and you took that step as a young guy, 17-year-old, 18-year-old or so, to take the step from the cloistered environment of Quebec to move into the great cosmopolitan metropolis of Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Well, I think growing up in that suburb of Point Clare with a loving family, but not a family. I think my father, at some level, had been shattered by the war. Something happened to him in London during the war, and I think he really understood that he was not going to be the one to teach me things. And he never was threatened when I fell into the orbit of other mentors, which was a very wonderful thing about him. And I knew, growing up in that kind of rather stultified world of Point Clare, where the only sort of spirit of the arts that came through were the Beatles. I remember the first night when Sgt. Pepper came out. I had a little plastic clock radio in my room, turned the dial, and I heard the opening notes of A Day in the Life. And I remember thinking, wow, that's what words can do. And that's why I became a writer. And I knew that I had two choices, either stay in Point Clare and become an accountant, or jump off bridges and become something. And I just started jumping off cliffs. And I only had one word in my vocabulary, which was yes, for any new experience. And even how I ended up at Harvard, I went to Brentwood College and had wonderful teachers. It wasn't a wonderful school there then, but it's a wonderful school now. Wonderful teachers. I had the teacher Gil Bunch, who was this great dramatic figure. And I learned to speak publicly because he would put a podium on the stage, put you stage right or left, and then get to the back of the hall and yell a noun at you. And the minute you heard the word, you had to slowly walk to the podium and speak in full paragraphs for 5 minutes about whatever that word was. And if you had one hesitation, one or a ah, you were just off the stage. And it was Shakespearean in its eloquence, and it taught you to have your mind where your mouth wasn't. So instead of umming and ahhing, you filled it with lyrical flourishes that meant nothing but satisfied the audience, And I've built a living on that. But I used to, another wonderful thing about growing up in British Columbia, especially back then, is that whereas today we've become such a thoroughly urban society, we love the idea of the North, but none of us go there. When I grew up, everybody went to the bush. It was part of the ethos of the age. And you could get these wonderful jobs. I mean, I would get jobs as a park ranger in wilderness parks where my job description was public relations and wilderness assessment. And 2 4-month seasons, I'd see 12 people. There was no one to relate publicly to. And I remember when I was 15, I was fighting fires. And it was during the Vietnam era. And our fire camps were filled with these American draft dodgers. And we were these kind of obsequious, obedient Canadian lads. And well trained by the likes of President Kelly. And these Americans were absolutely irreverent. They'd tell our bosses to piss off. And it was incredibly charismatic. And one of them had the Life magazine with the Harvard student strike of 1969 on the cover. And I thought in this atavistic way, that must be the university you go to become cool like these guys. So I applied to Harvard, having no idea where it was. I got in. I applied to Princeton, Brown, Williams, and Harvard. I had no idea about any of them. I got into all of them. My headmaster wanted me to go to Princeton. That meant I was not going there, so I went to Harvard. And my parents didn't have the money to fly down to Boston with me. And, oh, you're from Boston. And so I arrive at Logan Airport with my trunk, and I realized I don't actually know where Harvard is. So I saw this character with a Harvard T-shirt. I thought, well, he's got to know. But he didn't know either. So I dragged my trunk. Our family didn't take taxis, so I dragged my trunk through the subway system, got to Cambridge in 1970, came up. I was just a kid from British Columbia. Well, it was like a caravanserai of the spirit. The SDS were over here, the Trotskyists over here, the Krishnas were over here. Then I realized that I was 2 weeks early. My mom had made a mistake, and the dorms weren't going to be open. And it was more, to make it worse, it was a weekend, and I had no money. And my dad had wired some money to a bank, but I couldn't get in until Monday. So I dragged my trunk through Cambridge and knocked on the door of a church. And this pastor came out, a wonderful man, welcomed me in, put me up, but he turned out to be a prominent war resistor, and his basement was full of weathermen about to escape to Canada. So that was my entry into Cambridge. And I became...
Sounds really familiar to me.
And I mean, things got crazier and crazier. And then I ended up studying anthropology because the deadline was the following day. And I was drifting through this fantastic museum that you know well, the Peabody Museum of Ethnography. And there were these dioramas of these sort of Indians in all the colors of the rainbow, you know. And I walked out into the sunshine, and the deadline was the next day. I ran into a friend of mine. I said, what are you going to study? He said, anthropology. I said, what's that? Well, you study about Indians. I said, that'll do. And that was like Forrest Gump. So I started studying anthropology, and after 2 years of reading about Indians in books, I was sick of just reading about Indians. And I was in a cafe, there's a true story, in Harvard Square, and there's a National Geographic map of the world, ironically, right in front of my roommate and I, who was another rough-cuff kid from the West. He was a ranch kid from Spokane, Washington. He suddenly looked at the map, and he looked at me, he looked at the map, and he pointed to the high Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere, and I just watched my left arm lift and land on the Amazon. Now, if it had hit Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar, but having decided to go to the Amazon, there was only one man to see, this legendary plant explorer by the name of Richard Schultes, who shot blowguns in class and kept outside his door a bucket of peyote buttons available to his students as an optional laboratory experiment. Now, what I didn't know about him, I knew that mountains had been named for him in South America. I knew that he had disappeared in the Northwest Amazon in 1941 and lived for 13 years in isolation with uncontacted tribes and, enchanted by the wonder of the neotropical rainforest. I knew that as an undergraduate he had studied the peyote cult. I knew that he had sparked the psychedelic era by discovering the so-called magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. But I didn't know that he was such an Anglophile that one of his colleagues said of him that the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. He was so conservative, in fact, that he didn't, even though he was this icon of the 60s, he was so conservative that he didn't vote for the Republican Party. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution. He always voted for Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. So I knew none of this when I approached his fourth floor eyrie, knocked on the door, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British." That's all it took. I'm from British Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon and collect plants as you did. Now, at the time, I had never taken a biology class in my life, and didn't know anything about the Amazon. And he was, instead of asking me my credentials, this is a man that Prince Philip had called the father of the Amazon. Mountains had bore his name. He just peered across a mound of plant specimens through his antiquated bifocals and said, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And 2 weeks later, I was in the Amazon. And in order to placate my mother here in Victoria, I dropped by his office to pick up a few key pointers. I was about to embark for a year and a half. I had two things. I wanted to go to the Amazon, and I wanted to leave America until Nixon was no longer president. And he had three vital pieces of advice. First of all, he said, "Don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck." And then he said, don't forget to wear a pith helmet, because in 12 years he had never lost his bifocals. And the third piece of advice, which most assuredly did not placate my mother, was that I was not to come back from the Amazon without trying ayahuasca, the most potent of all the hallucinogenic preparations of the shaman's repertoire. And then, of course, he gave me 2 letters that might as well have been written by God, or at least Charles Darwin, for the doors that they would open in South America. And that was the beginning of my career as a botanical explorer. And it's wonderful because just last week, I received the David Fairchild Medal, which is a top worldwide award for botanical exploration. And when I accepted the award in Florida, I completely accepted it in the name and in honor of Richard Evans Schultes. But just to jump and finish the loop of that story, the most beautiful thing that happened is that I ended up writing his biography, which some of you know is a book called One River. And this was a book that took 6 years to write, enormous amount of research. And he himself had no capacity as a storyteller. He had no memory. Most of his memory were the sort of canards that he had repeated ad infinitum, but he had actually forgotten what he had really achieved. And so I was able to bring his entire world back to him by doing the archival research and actually finding out where he had actually gone and what he achieved. And I also, to lighten up a rather long narrative, I invented dialogue. And obviously I wasn't present for the meetings, but I was careful to root them in authenticity. I knew that they had happened, what the outcomes were, who the players were, even where the light was coming through the room. But nevertheless, I was quite nervous about how the old professor would respond to this device. Well, as it turned out, as he was slipping away in life, he kept that book by his bedside table, his wife told me, and every night when he couldn't sleep, he would read from it. And one time, just before he passed into senility, he took me aside at his home in Boston and said, "Wade, you won't believe what Mrs. Bedard said to me when I met her in 1943. Look, it's right here." And this was this beautiful thing, because here was this professor who had made my life possible. I was unable to give him back his life, even as he was fading away, as all old men tend to do. So in a beautiful way, it completed that cycle of student and mentor. And he, in his wisdom, always understood that the student was as important as the teacher in the lineage of knowledge.
Yeah, it's wonderful. As a young guy in Boston, I also went to hear Schultes because of our kind of folk interest in hallucinogenic materials. And he was the first guy I heard talk about gustatory hallucinations. We thought that's a taste hallucination. And but this guy with a blue pinstripe suit speaking with lantern slides, if I remember right.
Yeah. It was like to go to his lab was like to go back to the 19th century.
Yeah.
It was just absolutely incredible.
So he gave you a great gift,
Yeah.
and really gave you that path, that the river, to.
Well, what he was, we were chatting at lunch. What great mentors do, and this is why I answer every email I ever get from a young person, because the same time that it takes you to delete an email, you can just send a note back saying, "Wonderful son, follow your heart." Because when they send you emails, they're not really seeking anything from you. What they're trying to figure out is, here's someone that perhaps they admire, can I reach that person? And what you're really saying is, do I deserve to be in this world in such a place that I can speak to a Wade Davis in that case? Well, that's how I was when I was young. And I remember, that feeling. And Schultes was like that. There's a famous story where Schultes' main assistant was a man called Pacho Lopez, a boy who died of galloping influenza in 1948, and he later befriended a young man called Isidoro Cabrera, whose family had been completely wiped out by murder during the Civil War of La Violencia in the late 1940s in Colombia, farm burnt down and so on, and Schultes came upon him and he became his assistant. And in time, the Schultes-Cabrera collections in botany between 1950 and 1953 are world famous because of where they went. And Isidoro became a professor, and he became a doctorate. He became an honorary doctorate and so on, illustrious botanist. When I went to interview Isidoro about Schultes for the book, I said, "What was it like the first time you met Schultes?" And he looked at me and he said, "That man, he looked at me like I was somebody." It was beautiful. And that's what I've always tried to do with young people, is that because you never know who's the next Charles Darwin, and that's what a teacher has to do.
Right, and always dealing with that unformed that the youth that.
And if you
have
don't
many
answer
things.
that email, it's not a neutral gesture. It's a slap in the face of a young spirit.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Okay, so first part we talked about Wade and some of these experiences that growing up and life with Schultes, and I think we could probably just keep on going on Schultes stories because they're numerous and they're rich, and I think they teach us something about how we can relate to each other.
Well, I mean, you know, after 4 years in the Amazon, I was kind of growing sick of just collecting plants. I was looking for a new challenge, and there was always something in his fourth floor eyrie. And one miserable February day in Boston, he summoned me to his office and just said very simply, how would I like to go down to the Caribbean island of Haiti, infiltrate the secret societies and secure the formula of the folk preparation used to make zombies? I said, sure. Having no idea that it would consume 4 years of my life. You know.
Yes. Okay. And you can see the movie, which you can't do for many dissertations, actually.
No, I think it's the only PhD I've ever heard of is made into a
Turned into a
Hollywood
movie. That's right. Yeah.
Not a good movie.
No, you've got to take what you can get, right?
Hemingway said that if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should start off in Arizona, go to the California state line, throw the book over, and then go back to Tucson and have a drink.
So I'd like to just shift a little bit because you know the work you do is speaks to people who are involved in the environmental movement broadly, and you know many of the leaders, if you want to call them that, in the environmental movement are friends of yours. We were talking earlier about Rick Careless in Vancouver. David Suzuki is a friend. Many of these folks are, and so as you step back and look at what's going on, you know, we could look at globally, or we could look in Canada or North America at the environmental movement. Where is it moving, and where should it be moving, in your opinion? And where do we, as citizens, make our contribution to this movement around taking the environment seriously?
I mean, it's a really complicated question in a way.
You've got a PhD from Harvard.
One of the things I firmly believe is there are no enemies in the world. I mean, I for example, just was speaking this week at the TED conference about the Sacred Headwaters, and one of our concerns, of course, is that Shell Canada has a proposal to extract coal bed methane gas from the expansive meadows that by chance give birth to both the Skeena and the Stikine and the Nass, the three great salmon rivers of home. And I knew that the head of Shell, a man called Marvin Odom, was going to be in the audience with his wife. And even if he hadn't been there, I wouldn't have spoken in anything inflammatory terms. But I was very engaging and welcoming to him. And one of the ways I disarmed him, in a sense, was by getting the TED people to let him know that I was a private advisor to Ray Hunt, who is the owner of the biggest privately held oil company in the world. And that would be not something that he would have expected from someone he might have assumed to be an environmentalist. But I don't think of myself as an environmentalist. I'm a storyteller. I can't imagine how anyone cannot be. We're all environmentalists. I mean, I don't like the, but you know, the Ray Hunt story is sort of an interesting one, because I was giving a lecture, the Tate lecture at SMU, which is a very prestigious lecture, and I was speaking about shamanism and ethnobotany and voodoo and, you know, the preservation of languages, so this sort of work that I do at the National Geographic as an explorer in residence. And at the end of the evening, about midnight, I was back where I was staying, and I got a call from the president of SMU, and he said, "We've got someone who would like to meet with you in the morning." So I go in the morning, have breakfast with this fellow. I have no idea who he is. It turns out to be Ray Hunt. And he turned to me and said, "Wade, I didn't understand everything you had to say last night, but I got a little project in Peru, and my name's on this company, and my son's name's on this company, and I want to do it right, and I think you can help me do it right." His little bitty project was the biggest foreign investment in the history of Peru, a $6 billion investment in the liquefied natural gas plant at Camisea. So I called all my friends in Peru, from the presidential level down to the village level, and said, "Is this going to happen?" And the answer was yes. So the question wasn't if, but how. And so I called up Tom Lovejoy, who is the man who coined the term biodiversity, legendary, I suppose, environmentalist, but largely scientist. Mm-hmm. And Tom came on board, and we became a private advising group to Mr. Hunt. We take no money. Any money he gives us, we give to the environment, basically. And long story short, we gambled that he was a man of his word and of his integrity. And I can tell you that Bruce Babbitt, the former Secretary of Interior, a good friend of Tom, called me up one day and said, look, I don't want this pipeline to go there. He does, you know. So we called Mr. Hunt. 30 minutes later and $30 million later, the pipeline didn't go there. So I don't really believe in, you know, I mean, I went to college by working for Mill and Bloedel as a logger. You know, I had a lot of empathy for the men and women who fought off hunger with a chainsaw. You know, I remember once I was at Dean and Bay. We had a really rough logging camp on Haida Gwaii, and there was this guy Archie Miller, who was a blaster, and Greenpeace had done something, and it had been on the headline of the Vancouver Sun, which we got about 5 days late back then, and he was really in a foul mood in the kitchen, you know, and his throat felt like he had been in 1,000 explosions, you know, and so I go into the kitchen. He says, Archie, what's up, man? He was really saying effing assholes about Greenpeace. I go, well, what's the problem? He said, effing assholes, I'm being polite here, don't know a effing thing about pollution. I said, well, what are you talking about? Then he proceeded to tell me this extraordinary story of having been a hard rock uranium miner in the Northwest Territories after World War II. And what they used to do is they put the miners in sealed chambers and would explode cartridges of gas with aluminum particulate matter in the gas, with the idea that the aluminum particulate matter would coat the lungs, and then when they went down into the mines, the radioactive dust would gather in their lungs and be gagged up at the end of a shift. So Archie tells me this story, and he says, now that was fucking pollution. So, you know, I mean, you know, so I think that one of the things that is really seriously disturbing is the way that ideology has captured concern for the earth. I mean, when you think of, I mean, I was at the TED conference, for example, we did have this session on energy where I gave my little talk, but we also had T-Bone Pickens, who's a really interesting man talking about natural gas. We had Jim Hansen, the climate scientist, and the way that the climate issue has been turned into an ideological divide in the United States is really disturbing. And you know, I think we all felt that there was going to be a sort of as supplies of traditional sources of carbon became more and more reduced, there'd be this effortless century-long transition to alternatives. You know, but now with the availability of coal, new deposits of oil, and of course the enormous amounts of gas that are being made possible through unconventional techniques, fracking shale, fracking coal bed, we will have carbon-based energy if we want it for 300 years, in which case we better bloody well hope the climate change scientists are wrong. But the fascinating thing I find about it is that, you know, when you have a consensus in the scientific community as profound as it is, to question it is to question modernity itself, because the entire foundation of modernity has been our faith in scientific methodology. So I find it fascinating how individuals who actually celebrate modernity with an almost atavistic zeal will suddenly turn and cherry pick their science when convenient. And I had a fantastic assignment at Copenhagen. Do you remember the climate conference there, where at the last minute Nissan, which was launching their Leaf car, you know, the new Leaf car, and they didn't want to promote the car, they wanted to promote the need for the car. So their ad agency came to me and asked me if I'd go to this conference as a scientist and as an anthropologist with no editorial input whatsoever. All they gave me was this incredibly ferociously demanding schedule of deliveries for YouTubes and tweets and blogs and so on. And so it was a fantastic opportunity. I had 2 crews working round the clock for me, unlimited budget, and we basically dissected this conference, and it was so discouraging. I mean, the nation states, it's hard to know which one was more flaccid and pathetic. I mean, Canada, of course, was completely mute. You know, China spoke about reducing its carbon intensity, which implied that the net production of carbons could go up as long as it didn't surpass the steroidal growth of their economy. India basically said, you screwed up the world for 200 years, it's our turn. Saudi Arabia demanded compensation if we got away from an oil economy. The African states spoke of reparations as if there had been a carbon conspiracy afoot since the birth of colonialism. The EU was the most disingenuous at all because they were asking for massive cuts and claiming that they would match these cuts if other nations did the same, or they'd increase their cuts, but not letting anyone really know that they had already achieved half of that goal simply by accepting into the EU the failed states of the Soviet bloc. So each nation state was doing more than to stumble over its own idiocies, you know, and the only entities that made any sense whatsoever were the corporations, who were seriously dealing with this problem. And that gave me a strong sense that it's going to be free enterprise that's going to lead the way and not government. You know,
At least not national levels of
not
government.
national levels of government.
You know, one of the things I keep a little database on regarding this ideology capturing this discussion is I keep a database on death threats to scientists. Because, in fact, people who work in climate science now regularly get death threats. And while no one has been murdered yet, people have, a fellow at Lawrence Livermore Lab woke up one morning, doorbell rang, and he went downstairs and there was a dead, mutilated cat on his door after getting, you know, so this is really being, it's very serious. It's not just climate science.
One of the problems is how scientifically illiterate our society is. I mean, I find it amazing that if you wouldn't graduate a student from college who couldn't distinguish a poem from a painting, and yet we graduate students all the time who don't know the formula of photosynthesis, you know, which is a formula of life, and we're prepared to indulge, you know, the New Age movement. Its credo is, if I believe it, it's true, and we're prepared to indulge the most phantasmagorical ideas as if they're serious, and yet we remain blind to the wonder of what really is. I mean, remember, there was an absolutely dreadful book that came out in the late 70s called The Secret Life of Plants. Did you know? This is a book that said that, you know, plants like to listen to Mozart and, you know.
Baxter.
My friend Timothy Plowman, who was a great botanist, a great musician, absolutely hated that book. And he said, why would a plant give a shit about Mozart? And he said, and even if it did, why should that impress us? They can eat light. Isn't that enough? You know? And to me, one of the things as universities we really need to do, I mean, I often think that, you know, I never took a single course of biology in my life. I got through LCC and I got through Brentwood without ever having to study biology. And I never took a biology course in my life until third year of university. And I fell so in love with biology that I got my PhD in biology. But when I came time to study the metabolic pathways, photosynthesis, the Krebs cycle, I had studied so much anthropology that for me, a lot of kids have trouble memorizing that stuff, but for me it was instantaneous, like, because they were like origin myths. And I remember at Harvard, I got thrown out of the Science Center library the night that I understood the Krebs cycle because I made so much noise. I started screaming and running around to people. I said, do you know how this works? And literally they had to escort me out, the security. But you know, I feel that that's a real gap I don't think anybody should be allowed to graduate from university without studying a basic course in the science of life.
I remember grade 5, photosynthesis, Dorchester, one of the elementary schools, and same thing, that experience of just, I couldn't believe it. That was exactly what I thought. Plants eat light.
Well, it's just,
and
you know,
that's
you know, that water and carbon dioxide sparked by photons of light make carbohydrate and oxygen. I mean, that's botanical verse. I mean, that's more important.
That's awe that we can get from nature, that we can get through our spiritual experiences, and we can have those same kind of experiences at the molecular level. You know, the extraordinariness of all this stuff going on inside our bodies.
I mean, let me. One of the things that I think is interesting to talk about, you know, when you raise the issue of environment. I mean, what does concern me about as an environmentalist, if you will, is again, as an anthropologist, trying to understand how is it that we do what we do to the earth. You know, I mean, if you think about it, you know, if the journey into the genetic essence of our being has been created a great liberating insight, the other great moment in our lifetimes, of course, is when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon on Christmas Eve 1968 and saw for the first time not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And we really suddenly saw that this was a finite blue planet floating in the velvet void of space. And you ask yourself, what is it that we do to the, how do we do what we do to the Earth? I mean, you know, when I write about sacred geography, for example, what do I mean? Again, I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. What does it mean for, what's the difference between someone raised in Peru to believe that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct their destiny versus a kid raised in Victoria to believe that a mountain is a pile of rock ready to be mined? How is it that when I grew up on this island, I was taught to believe that the forests existed to be cut? That was the foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry that I learned in school and practiced in the woods as a logger. That made me very different than the First Nations, who were raised to believe that these forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven and the cannibal spirits that would have to be embraced during the Hamansa initiation, such that the wisdom of the wild could come back to the community in the potlatch. Now, the issue isn't whether those forests are cellulose and board feet or the domain of the spirit. The interesting thing is how the belief system mediates the human interaction with the natural world with profoundly different consequences for the ecological footprint, whereby my particular lineage, culturally and intellectually, spiritually, tore these forests asunder in 3 generations. The First Nations lived with a relatively light footprint on the land for several centuries, millennia, in fact. And I think that's an important thing for us to pay attention to. That's really where our environmentalism should be focused. In other words, you know, how did we get to this place? Well, you can trace it quite literally in our intellectual tradition. We wanted in the Renaissance to escape the tyranny of absolute faith. We wanted to escape the tyranny of the medieval church. When Descartes famously said that all that exists was mind and matter, he was really anticipating the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is perfectly expressed in that phrase by Thomas Jefferson over his memorial in Washington. He says, "I swear upon the altar of Almighty God." They weren't quite prepared to leave God to fight against all forms of tyranny over the mind of man. And once we said life was mind and matter, we swept away all possibilities for myth, magic, mysticism, and metaphor, which liberated us in many ways. And it certainly sparked the whole intellectual crusade and journey that became the scientific revolution. But at the same time, as Saul Bellows said, science made a house cleaning of belief. And so phenomena that could not be measured could not exist. And so in one gesture, we de-animated the earth. And I strongly believe that we can only do what we do to the earth because we really do believe it's just a pile of rock ready to be mined. And even if we accept, even if we want to believe that, which is not what most people around the world believe, we have to look at the consequences of that belief. Like, one of the things I find so fascinating about the way we industrialize wild is the fact that whether, I mean, what does it take to get a mining project going in British Columbia? Well, you cobble together a company that may have great depth or may have less history than my dog. You secure online the subsurface rights to a place you've never been, the stories of which you've never heard, the pain of a long winter you've never experienced, nor the promise of a bright spring. And as long as you can guarantee the government a flow of revenue, either in the form of taxation or royalties, you by definition secure the right to transform that place for all time for the benefit not of the people, but the benefit of yourself and your stockholders. But what I find interesting about that, there's not a single metric in the calculus that we use to rationalize the industrialization of the wild that places any monetary value whatsoever on the land as it exists, or conversely, any cost to the commons, the rest of us who are not stockholders, who are not working for the enterprise, implicit in its transformation, and one could say in its desecration. Now, we take that as a given because it's how we do in a resource-driven economy industrialize wild, but it's quite unusual when you consider how most people around the world think about land and the responsibility of human beings to that land. I mean, it's a little bit like you're, you know, selling roses here at Royal Roads from this wonderful garden. And I walk along and I say, well, look, I'll buy all your roses. And I'll tell you what, I'm not only going to buy your roses, I'm going to give you jobs. I'm going to pay your students to pick the roses. And more than that, I'm going to put a tax and make sure I pay my HST So that'll come back and that'll help your university. But then as I'm walking away, I say, by the way, the castle is going to be obliterated. And you say, well, wait a minute, well, who's going to compensate? That's not my problem. I'm buying, the transaction's about roses. And if I leave this valley completely transformed for all time, that's your problem. And that seems to me very odd. And until we stop thinking about landscape that way, that doesn't mean we don't establish mines at all. And that doesn't mean we don't, use timber. What it means is if we actually somehow monetized the land, it would force us to pay more careful attention to where we do and where we don't put mines. So for example, in the Sacred Headwaters, which of course is this remarkable place in northern British Columbia where we could throw England and the English would never find it, one of the proposals which has been approved by the environmental assessment process is a project by Imperial Metals, which is our 75th largest mining company in Canada, to put an open pit copper and gold mine on the flank of a mountain that has been long revered by the Tahltan people as a kind of wildlife sanctuary in the sky, because it's the site of the highest population in the world of stone sheep. It's a nursery of this incredible charismatic species. And by the design of that mine, they will be processing 30,000 tons of rock for 30 years, and with the toxic tailings that will be generated, they are, by the project design, simply going to dump those into an alpine lake that drains to another series of alpine lakes, which eventually drains in the Iskut River, which is the main affluent or tributary of the salmon-bearing Stakina River. And what I find interesting is a couple things. Given that the project plan calls for the dismantling of a mountain, the inundation or the burying of an alpine lake with toxic tailings, and the destruction of the habitat of a charismatic ungulate species, you do have to ask yourself, what would it take to fail an environmental assessment process in British Columbia? And we have 4,000 copper mines in the world. There's some great places to put copper mines. I was flying into Kamloops not long ago to speak at the great university, Thompson Rivers University, which is really a cool university. Boy, they've done a great job there, taking that community college, and it's just like elevates amazing students from all around the world. But you fly into Kamloops, and there's a copper mine there, right? And it's great. I mean, it's just desolate, Okanagan stuff. I've always thought we should trade the Okanagan for Alaska, but that's another thing. No, I'm just teasing. I'm sorry. My uncle grew up there. My family goes there. I'm not just joking. I love it. No, but seriously, I mean, that's a good place to put a copper mine, because there are no but I think because we don't, in some sense, monetize or even think in these terms about where we put these mines, I think it makes it a lot easier for us to sort of embrace a policy that says any place a mine can go, it should go. And I think that that's not really a great way of thinking. And so to put a mine on top of Tawdigan Mountain, which is has such incredible wildlife values that for 40 years the government has not allowed any person, native or non-native, to hunt up there with a rifle, to put a mine there is rather like drilling for oil in the Sistine Chapel.
So that really leads me to almost my last kind of question. Karl Heinrich Robert, some of you will know him as the founder of the Natural Steppe. He wrote, "The question of reaching sustainability," which is what you're just talking about now, "is not about if we will have enough energy or enough food or other tangible resources. The question is, will there be enough leaders in time?" And so, how do you see this when you look at the, at the various projects and movements and campaigns? How do you see Royal Roads has a focus through all of its programs on leadership? And I wonder if you just talk a bit about your sense of you as a leader or leadership in the environmental sustainability.
Well, I think one thing that I find odd about Canada today is that we love the idea of the North, but we never go there. When I met with Premier Campbell before he left office a couple times to talk to him about this area, and I like Gordon Campbell. I think he's very smart. And but I was astonished to learn that our Premier had never been to a quarter of the province. Literally, he had never been to a quarter of the province. My father-in-law was a U.S. Senator from Illinois. He used to campaign in the Amish districts, even though they don't vote. He just thought they should be able to meet their senator. So I found that kind of unusual. And I think there's a certain kind of psychic disconnect. We have leaders of many of these companies who live in Vancouver and celebrate the snows of Whistler and the glorious Gulf Islands, often phoning their colleagues in Toronto and New York and boasting about living in beautiful British Columbia, while their day jobs tear apart our hinterland. I had a very funny experience once up in near where I live. And to be completely transparent, one of the reasons I'm obviously both aware of and concerned about the Red Chris mine is that I'm the closest private holding to it. The lodge where I've raised my children, where I've lived for 35 years, is 3 miles as a crow flies from the open pit of the proposed mine. And could accuse me of being self-interested, almost like a NIMBY, and I plead guilty, because if you're not prepared to protect your own land, what are you going to protect? But I was at a neighboring lodge that I've known all 6 owners back. And the third owner was a particularly good on his trap line at Bowser Lake, and it was kind of a story right out of Jack London. 90 feet of snow fell in the valley that year. The Mounties couldn't get in to look for his corpse until the spring. And actually, Outside Magazine in the States asked me to write a cover story on the essence of Canada, and Mike had just died and disappeared, and I was supposed to be with him because he was going to be spending Christmas with us in Vancouver. And I used that heartfelt story as a lead for the essay, and I mentioned that 90 feet of snow had fallen. Of course, the Americans wouldn't believe that 90 feet of snow could fall anywhere, so in Chicago they changed it to inches. I changed it back to feet, they changed it to inches, I went back to feet. Finally, I got a letter from the Mounties in Stewart saying that it was feet. Still, the Americans didn't believe them. So anyway, I was in Mike's lodge thinking about Mike, and there was a stranger in the corner, a nice man, having a cup of tea, and a nice woman walked in, and I could tell, even though, in the old days, when I was a forestry engineer, we always were pretty obvious with our hard hats and our steel-toed boots and our fluorescent vests. Now all these engineers look like they come out of a Patagonia catalog. Anyway, she walked in, a very nice woman. He was a very nice man. And they began to have, and it was clear from the juxtaposition of the moment that she had just come back from the Red Chris site, and I knew that they were expediting the loads, the helicopter loads out of Mike's lodge, had been his lodge. And these 2 wonderful people began this breathless conversation. And it went like this. Wow, did you, I know, have you ever, I've never seen so much wildlife in my life. I've never seen so many sheep. Did you see the grizzly bears? I've never seen grizzly bears. Like, the wolves were everywhere. It's the most beautiful place. You ever been up here? No, never been up here. How about you? No, never north of Williams Lake. I got to Prince George once, never up here. Wow, here they were having this breathless conversation about a place they had never been, the most beautiful place they had ever seen, and yet it was their corporate and bureaucratic duty to destroy it. He was associated with Ministry of Mines. She was a very nice engineer for Imperial Metals, decent people, but they didn't see that kind of disconnect. And that's what the Tahltan elders speak about. James Dennis, who is a wonderful old man I've known for 35 years, said to me that, one of the things you have to realize about this country, it's so special. You forget that until they built the Panama Canal, the northwest coast of BC was about as far from Europe as you could get. So the Tahltan Nation, whose territory is roughly the size of Switzerland, when Montreal was entering its 3rd century, and when the lower trunk of the Amazon had been explored for 350 years, the Tahltan people of British Columbia still had not had European contact. In the lower 48 states of the U.S., the farthest you can get away from a maintained road is 20 miles. In the northwest quadrant of British Columbia, an area the size of the state of Oregon, there's one road, a narrow sliver of asphalt that goes up to the Yukon. So it really is the kind of place you could throw England and the English wouldn't find it. And so the elders there, those who escaped the residential schools, I knew and recorded mythology from an old man who had really had no sustained contact with whites until he was 43. And James Dennis once said to me, we should have a deal where every company that wants to come into our territory has to bring up all their children. The entire board has to bring up all their children and grandchildren. And we'll all get together. We'll show them the land, and then we're going to put the kids off on their own. Because the kids, like being kids, will cut a deal, and it'll be a fair deal. And the deal will be real simple. For every tree cut in Tahltan country, a rose bush in West Vancouver in the home of the owner of that company goes down. For every drop of toxic waste that goes into a river or a lake in Tahltan country, a drop of toxic waste will go into the rec center where the children of those corporate executives recreate. Now that notion, which sounds to the urban ear ridiculous, is exactly what the Tahltan people say when they say this land is not just our land, this is our kitchen, this is our commissary, this is our sanctuary, it's the burial grounds of our ancestors, and the people that own it are the generations as yet unborn. And that is an attitude that we should learn from in Canada. And instead, we have 41 major industrial proposals coming into the Tahltan country. We're expecting Tahltan people who number in that territory roughly 1,500, at a community like Iskut that I know so well, where my friend Oscar once said 45 suicides and me and my sister stopped counting. And we're expecting people with limited education who have been traumatized in so many ways by residential schools, alcoholism, and everything else, to suddenly have the wherewithal to make these kinds of decisions. Take, for example, and this is one of my points I made with Premier Campbell, I opened a picture, I don't know if you noticed when the images shot through of a very handsome Tahltan man with a 30-30 across his, that's Oscar Dennis. And that photograph was in the National Geographic magazine, and women from all around the world, I'm not kidding, Oz used to call me up and say, Wade, there's this woman from Moscow coming to see me. I said, man, you just had someone from Poland last week. I know. He said, I know. And I said, well, look, you don't speak Russian or Polish. I mean, what are you doing, Oz? He said, they don't really come for conversation. But the point is, I showed that picture. I showed that picture to the Premier, and I said, and I had the permission of James Dennis, Oscar's father, I said, let me tell you about my friend. In the last 5 years, Oscar's brother hung himself in his mother's basement. His other brother died of drowning because he never learned how to swim, because there's no swimming pool in Iskut, and the lakes are too cold. His other brother died of medical malpractice in Prince Rupert because he was misdiagnosed as a drunk Indian when he had a severe seizure. Oscar's sister got an ICBC settlement in Prince George and blew it in drugs and prostitution. And Oscar's own daughter, his only daughter, blew her head off in Terrace playing Russian roulette with a handgun. And I said, Mr. Premier, in the 5 years that those tragedies have afflicted one family in Iskut, Barrick Gold at Eskay Creek has taken 400 tons of gold and 5,000 tons of silver out of Tahltan territory. At a market value today, and albeit, of course, then it was much less, but at today's market value, had that remained in the ground, it'd be $25 billion. And in the 10 years that that mine operated, and ecologically, it was an exemplary mine, but in the 10 years that that mine operated, the infrastructure at the community of Iskut did not change one bit. And I said to the Premier, I'd like to know why there's not a swimming pool, why there's not a hockey rink, why there are not trust funds for these kids to go to college, trust funds for small entrepreneurs to get low-interest loans. How can it possibly be in British Columbia that every white kid along the Yellowhead Highway expects to get the kinds of services from this government that you deny to the First Nations, even as you, sitting in Victoria, not even bothering ever to visit the land where your signature is signing off the rights and the fate of that country to mineral development, and yet not one bit of reward goes back to these people, with the exception of, in the case of SK, about $135 million over 10 years that went largely to wages to keep certain Tahltan families employed as chambermaids and as maintenance workers on the road, and certain no-bid road maintenance and catering contracts that went to an entity called the Tahltan Native Development Corporation. But fundamentally, the infrastructure of Iskut did not change one bit. Now that is not an issue of the environment, that's about basic human rights. And that's so if these mines are going to go, given the fact that by every definition of British jurisprudence and law that we follow in Canada, this land has never been treated, it's never been conquered, it's not just a romantic idea that these lands remain the domain of the First Nations. This is coming right out of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which has been reaffirmed by Supreme Court decision after Supreme Court decision. So if we're going to put mines in this country, and I'm going to ensure, even if this Red Chris mine goes ahead, because one of the principal owners of that mine is a guy I know, Murray Edwards, owner of the Calgary Flames. Together we served on the board of the Banff Centre for the Arts for 10 years. Murray gave $10 million to the Banff Centre very generously for this wonderful fancy new building we have. He doesn't know this yet, but I'm going to make sure that Murray gives $10 million for a hockey rink in Iskut if they put this mine in Tahltan country. Because it's only fair, you know.
Well, we could just keep on going like this, but I think we're pretty close. We have another 25 or so minutes,
Sure.
And I think it'd be only fair for questions and comments. And I don't know whether, Raina, do you have a mic, or do you want to run around, or should I run around? Or? So I saw a hand up immediately over in this area here.
I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the idea of monetizing the resources. Do you mean mitigating the harms, or what are you thinking?
Well, what I mean by that is, you know, I don't think it'd be very difficult to come up with a set of objective criteria that allowed you to necessarily say this land is worth X, this land's worth Y. But there are major efforts at thoughtful environmental groups like World Wildlife Fund in the United States to try to figure out how you could actually do that. And I think, I'm not trying to suggest that you could suddenly say, well, this acre is worth this much, this is worth that much, but rather if you began to even think in those terms, I think it would inform our overall development process. So that, for example, the kinds of, and I've read very carefully, for example, the reports on the Red Chris development. And if you really look at the environmental assessment criteria, you know, it's all very specific to, you know, specific environmental challenges, you know, capturing in tailings pond, protecting this, and, you know, and if we're going to do this here, we've got to mitigate here, and all. But at no point do you step back and say, wait a minute, you know, should this be happening at all? The entire assumption is that if it can happen based exclusively on market driven criteria, in other words, is the price of copper high enough to warrant the expense of the investment? Will the return be sufficient? As long as that answer is yes, the mine goes ahead, and then it's just a simple question of the company spending what it takes to actually satisfy these sort of bureaucratic stipulations. But at no point in the process is it encouraged to really ask deeply as a society, should there be a mine here at all? And that's what I really sort of mean as a first step towards attempting to monetize the resource and to monetize the cost to the commons implicit in its destruction in the case of a mountain like this. And instead you'll force these companies to spend kind of absurd amounts of money on studies that are kind of pro forma, that the results of which invariably conclude that the mine can go ahead, and it seems like a kind of a bit of a charade to me, the way these processes really go ahead, as opposed to, you know, I mean, you'll hire a wildlife biologist at huge expense, an individual whose entire business is based on being able to do these kind of environmental assessment studies. So you know well that if that scientist were to consistently come up with recommendations that mines not go ahead, he would not likely be the wildlife biologist who you'd go to for your next mine assessment process. So there's an inherent kind of bias towards a certain conclusion, which is a completely natural human thing. And so these environmental assessment processes at some level, I think, are just huge impediments on industry, hugely costly kind of charades that we go through, where what we really should be doing is looking at a more macro level and saying, I don't care if there's copper in this mountain, you don't put a open pit copper mine on the richest wildlife habitat in British Columbia. Particularly in the case of this mountain, it's not just that it has that wildlife habitat, it anchors the 9 headwater lakes of the Iskut River, and that were this country, and don't forget this country is so spectacular that John Muir called but the lower third of the Stickeen River a Yosemite 150 miles long, and he named his dog after that river, Enchantment. It anchors these headwater lake chains, which is exactly where the Jasper Lodge will go. It's exactly where the Banff Springs Hotel would go. It's exactly the epicenter of where this, and I work at the National Geographic. We have a huge travel business, and what you see in high-end travel is that what people want is authenticity, and truly authentic wild wilderness areas of the world have become increasingly rare. I mean, those of you who try to visit, for example, the Serengeti, it all feels as if these lions are blown up every day, like props. It's very worn out. And this is an area that can really, don't forget, the travel business is a $4.5 trillion business. It's the biggest business on earth. The total capitalization of every mining company in the world added up together does not total $1 trillion. So to put one mine that's going to generate employment for 200 people on top of this mountain that's a sanctuary in the sky that anchors a site that could be the new Yosemite of Canada, it's just so counterproductive. Here we are, we've spent this money to build this incredible highway, the Stewart-Cassiar, that allows you in short order from Smithers, which itself is a fantastic tourist destination. In 6 hours, you can be in the greatest wilderness area, the most beautiful wilderness area in the world. Don't forget, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado has 5 million people visited every year. 27,000 people float between Glen Canyon Dam and the Hoover Dam. The river does not even reach the sea. It's been so compromised it enters the Sea of Cortez, a river only in name. Its flow is controlled by technicians at dams responding to the electrical and water needs of Las Vegas, San Diego, Los Angeles, and Phoenix. All of these rivers run free. How many of you can name the wildest and greatest canyon of Canada? Think about it. This is going to embarrass you. It's great. I'm delighted, actually. What is the greatest and the wildest canyon in Canada, known to the greatest kayakers in the world as a K2 of whitewater challenges? What? The Stickeen. The Grand Canyon of Stickeen. In all of history, no rafts ever made it. Only 50 kayakers of world-class caliber have ever gotten through it. And that canyon is sitting 30 miles from where this mine's going to go. Spatsizi Wilderness, the Serengeti of Canada, the greatest roadless wilderness park in British Columbia, again, 40 miles from where this mine's going to go. Edzaidza, the sacred mountain of the Tahltan, obsidian fields that cover the horizon. Beautiful volcanic landscape. 30 miles from where this mine's going to go. To put a mine in the epicenter here is literally like drilling in the Sistine Chapel. And for the sake of one mine, we are going to industrialize this area that could rank as one of the greatest destinations for travel and tourism. I think the interesting precedent for us is what happened on Haida Gwaii. I lived and worked as a logger, as I said, on Haida Gwaii. If you had told me in 1976, when I was there, that we were going to save the South Moresby and create a park called Gwaii-Haanas, I would have said you're out of your mind. It was exactly the same challenge. We had tree farm licenses that had been let. We had major contract shows which had infrastructure in place. We certainly had a way of thinking in the logging industry that would never have readily given up its rights to harvest those forests. And yet because the Haida stood up, because the women wore those button blankets, because the Canadian people rallied, it was possible not only to create Gwaii-Haanas, our remarkable park, a gesture which not only saved this incredibly rich and important area, it also sparked the revitalization of one of the most illustrious cultural traditions in the world, that of the Haida. At the same time, it elevated the entire place from this forgotten string of islands named after a forgotten queen to to Haida Gwaii, which has now become one of the iconic destinations in the travel world, in the same way that people must see the pyramids, and they must see the Taj Mahal, and they must see the Galapagos, they must see Haida Gwaii. And the Haida people have a $70 million trust fund to send their kids to university. This could be the same thing with the Tahltan, and all it needs is government will and the will of the people to say that, yes, we can put lots of other mines around the periphery of the core of the Sacred Headwaters. There's 41 proposals, many of them offering great promise. But to put these two in the very epicenters, to compromise that place for all time in order to employ, 2,000 people in the creation of the mine, which implies not Tahltan employment, of course, but rather itinerant miners coming in from elsewhere in the province, and then finally 200 jobs, only probably half of which will go to Tahltan people. That is nothing upon which to build the foundation of a nation. So this is about, the famous story in the whole history of the American West is the story of the creation of the Glen Canyon Dam, which inundated what Elliot Porter famously called the canyon that nobody knew. And there is not one person in the United States who would not give anything to be able to go back in time and save that canyon. And Tottigan Mountain is our Glen Canyon. If we allow this mine to go, and this is a mine that, by the way, has sailed through the environmental process, all it's waiting for is subsidized power. Now, the government doesn't speak of subsidized power because what we're doing is spending $404 million to extend the hydro grid up to nowhere, because the hydro grid is being expanded to a place called Bob Quinn Lake where there is simply a highway yard. Now, there's nothing wrong with getting hydro into a quarter of our province, but the problem is that that grid is being extended not to fuel or light the homes of people, but to allow these mining companies that cannot go ahead without subsidized power to afford to build their own lines south to that grid. Now, don't talk of subsidy, there'll be talk of private investment and equity, but the truth of the matter is we're not spending $404 million to bring electricity to 1,000 people in the province, because Dease Lake already has its own hydro generating system. And to make it even a little bit more cynical, of that $404 million, fully $130 million of it is coming from the green fund that was set aside by the federal parliament to get us off carbon economy. And the rationale for that is by putting the money into that extension of the Northwest transmission line, we will get the community of Iskut, an Indian reserve of 300 people, off diesel generating power. So you are spending 130. Now, this is a level of cynicism that I don't think we should tolerate in our elected officials. So the extension of that grid is actually the extension of power to facilitate the construction of these lines. The Red Chris mine cannot go ahead without having subsidized power. So we are not only allowing this company, Imperial Metals, Canada's 75th largest mining company. What does that really translate to? It means a handful of men who have run a stocks, a scam. They've attracted investment. They want to create this mine, and God bless them for doing it. It's free enterprise, and it's their right to do. But they're going to be the beneficiaries. Their stockholders will be the beneficiaries. But it's not going to do anything for my children. It's not going to do anything for your children. It's not going to do anything for the people of British Columbia, except to leave them having in a landscape that has been absolutely violated and squandered for limited gain. When instead, if we focused on this valley, we could make it one of the great destinations of the world. And in doing so, we would give a great gift to the Tahltan people.
So, Wade, we get blinders on in terms of what we think, our assumptions about how the world works. And the technological society that we live in is really concerned about doing the thing right. And traditional societies tend to ask the question more is this the right thing? And I think that what you're describing here is very much, we don't go deep enough. We do the cost-benefit analysis, and we can say, yes, the right thing to do. But whether it can be done right, but it may not be the right thing. And
well, I think one of the reasons we really want to take a breath here is that a couple things. First of all, the mining sector has been hampered in British Columbia by regulations, politics, and so on. There is a strong sense that we want to show that we still have a viable mining sector. And unfortunately, this mine happens to be first in line, and it's probably the worst of all mines to go. I mean, there were the Galore Creek mine, for example, from Nova Gold was only, I mean, that was a fantastic mining possibility. And the other thing we should recognize is that all these mines are only viable because of the steroidal growth of Asian markets and the increase of commodity prices that has led copper to go up tenfold within a few years. The price of gold soared to $1,800 an ounce. And rather than seeing this as an opportunity where we can finally, in a resource-driven economy, turn ourselves into a seller's market. And what I mean by that is in the old days, you know, if a mining enterprise came into a small town in northern Ontario or the Yukon, you know, the civic leaders had really no choice but to accept it. Otherwise, they might never again have that opportunity. But now with the price of commodities only going higher, it seems to me it's an opportunity to sort of really deliberately decide where and when and at what pace and for whose benefit and at what cost to the environment these mines should go ahead. And instead of adopting such a sort of a tempered view of things, we seem to have both on the federal level and the provincial level a kind of a Wild West scenario that if a mine can go, it should go. And I don't think that's necessarily the case.
I think the microphone is somewhere. And we can go to the end here, and then we'll come to Robin and give a look.
Thank you. Excellent information. I've spent time up there myself, and I think the Valley Special as well. What's the message you want to give to the people in this room in terms of stopping the mine?
Well, I was trying to be polite. No, I honestly, I think I was just, you know, as I said at the TED conference, and the president of Shell was in the audience, and I had a nice meeting with him afterwards. And of course, Shell has a tenure over 1 million acres to explore for coal bed methane gas at the headwaters. And you know, again, I don't believe in good guys and bad guys or enemies. I mean, I think probably, in fact, and I don't know this in any way to be the case, but my guess is what in fact happened at Shell. They're an energy exploration company. They knew about the Bowser Basin. They knew about the anthracite deposit at Groundhog Mountain in the Clapan. 10 years ago, they applied for a permit to explore for unconventional sources of gas. They weren't asked to, and they had no obligation to go through some complex public review process. It was simply a tenure offered. And they really had no idea, that they were going to walk into a kind of hornet's nest of resistance from the Tahltan First Nation, but also I think they quite honestly had no idea that they were about to walk into the Sistine Chapel. So it was interesting, and it shows you, just to give credit to Paul Gilbert and the Bateman Center here at Royal Roads, all these photographs, which I'm sorry that you can't really see because of the illumination in the room, but you'll see them in the book. These all came about from something called the International League of Conservation Photographers, of which I'm a member. And what happens is we raise foundation money, bring the top photographers of the world to an area, and let them loose in helicopters to get these images, and then they keep the control of the images, but the images are available for conservation. It's a wonderful idea. And as a result, you can take an area that from the ground may seem to be not that particularly special, because after all, if I came into Goldstream Park on a gray day, it would look very different than if I had spent a year there shooting it in perfect light through the lens of a great photographer. So you suddenly, and as I projected these in Long Beach at the TED conference, we projected them on a screen about 6 stories tall, so with 6 high-definition cameras. And so as I was speaking, these images were flashing, and I could hear the breath coming out of the audience. And when I later met Marvin's wife, who's a wonderful woman, she just basically said, you know, honey, we can't possibly go in there. You know, it's like, you know, she said, I mean a little joking, but I mean, you could just see that they recognized, hey, you know, I mean, they're not bad people. They didn't know. I mean, the head of Shell in Houston didn't know that this one project and this whole empire happened to be going into this area that actually is like the Sistine Chapel. And when the Tahltan people got this book, you know, some of them, my friend Oz said, were holding it to their chests because they themselves had never seen their country so beautifully portrayed. It's sort of like, you know, when you see your grandchildren photographed by Annie Leibovitz, you didn't realize how beautiful they were, you know. And I think that's the real power of imagery, and I want to credit Paul Gilbert and the Bateman Center. When we were just getting this idea in mind, Paul jumped on it and gave us a contribution that really put us over the top to be able to do it. So when we say what we would like people to do, one of the strongest feelings I have is that if these decisions are being made, they shouldn't be made behind the backs of the Canadian people. And back to this idea that we're a thoroughly urban society, but some people are going to the north, and the people that are going to the north are the vanguard of this kind of this tsunami of industrial development. And I think that these sorts of decisions should be made by the Canadian people in general. So what we're trying to do with the book, in a sense, is if we can't get the people to come to the north, we bring the north to the people, and hopefully we can sort of generate both a provincial, a national, and an international debate on the future of this country, such that you know, egregious decisions and even permits made under a cloud of malfeasance can be revoked. Even if this company has gone through the environmental assessment process, that doesn't mean that the mine should go ahead. And once the Canadian people recognize what is at stake, I think it's up to us to call upon the government to reverse this. And incidentally, just as in the case of Guayhanas, offer fair and proper compensation to Imperial Metals for its efforts, to encourage Imperial Metals in its efforts to keep the Huckleberry mine going, to develop its property in Williams Lake, but just get out of the Sacred Headwaters and with proper compensation. So at the back of the book, and through Forest Ethics as an organization, the other thing that's sort of interesting about this whole campaign is I know that the Prime Minister has made some comments lately about American NGOs sort of pouring money into Canada. All I could say to that is I wish it were true. I would have been happy to accept it. But the fantastic thing about this effort is it's all been based on hunters, property owners, tall-tan leaders, brave men and women who have stood out in the rain on blockades, who have gotten arrested. Jerry Kwok, one of the legendary guides who has been in a wheelchair since he had a stroke, was arrested out of the wheelchair as he stood on the blockade. Magical things that have happened, like when they first put up the blockade to keep Fortune Minerals out of the headwaters and Shell out of the headwaters, there was a little bit of grumbling on the blockade because it was July month and the sockeye were running in the lower Stikine and everybody wanted to be fishing. And it was a little nerve-wracking, and then suddenly the miracle happened. This big 18-wheel trailer, double tandem trailer, came down the Stuart Cassiar from Alaska and conveniently rolled over right at the base of Tawdigan Mountain. And the driver wasn't hurt, but he was carrying in his load sockeye, salmon from Alaska destined for the Seattle market. So hundreds of tons of salmon just poured out on the roadway right by the blockade. So within an hour, the whole forest was golden with drying sockeye. So the people didn't have to go to the river came to them. And that became, you know, and then the other thing that's important, seriously, is that in this book, when you read this book, the text of this book is not a pretty picture photo essay. You know, some people said to me, you know, don't tell the truth about the corruption and the way that industry and government has been gaming the accommodation and consultation process, or the lack of transparency on the part of some of the institutions claiming to represent the Indigenous people. You know, just tell a nice, sweet story about how beautiful land is. And I said, you know, I'm not writing a book that the miners can take home from Tawdigan as a souvenir. I'm writing a book that's going to try to keep the miners from going to Tawdigan, even as I want to invite those miners to go to Galore or to go to the other sites that have been identified that can really be the foundation of an economy and of employment for all people of that country, native and non-native alike.
Wait, maybe you have one last question. Randy, Robin Cox, who's a faculty member here at Royal Roads.
Really, the question was asked previously, so I guess my further question to that is, the book is beautiful, and thank you very much for this talk. It seems like we need a flash mob mentality in getting this out beyond print. So I'm just wondering if you have other suggestions, concrete or other things you're doing that would capitalize on that?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, the time is of the essence in the sense that the government has put the shell development into two-year moratoria, and the second moratorium is up this year at the end of 2012. So the fate of this country, in some sense, will be determined this year. I think it's very likely that Shell, because they're fundamentally a good corporate citizen, also more practically, the price of natural gas has dropped so precipitously since this project began, from $9 to roughly $3. There's not a lot of reason for them to go into a place where they're not welcome, as Marvin said. It's not what they do. They don't want not to be welcomed. Like even the oil pipeline in Peru with Mr. Hunt, I remember him famously saying that his goal with that pipeline was to make sure that every community that was not along the trajectory of the pipeline would wish it had been. And that's what we managed to do through the philanthropy. And so, these companies aren't monolithic forces of darkness, as the environmentalists sometimes paint them to be. These are just decent people they're giving us our energy, and they're struggling every day. I mean, Shell is struggling every day with how we're going to solve this energy problem. And I'll tell you, we should be grateful that people like Shell are doing exactly what they're doing. Because I sure don't want to live in a world without energy, and I don't think any of us do. But that said, I think Shell, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to go ahead with this. And when I've tried to even suggest, I say all that with no insider information, it just is logical deduction. But I'd like to take it a step forward and invite Shell, in a sense, to join us as they recognize, and we've come to recognize, as the people of BC have come to recognize, the beauty and uniqueness of this place. We have a chance together to save it before it's too late. And there's nothing I'd love better than for Shell to march forward with us as we attempt to do the extraordinary, to draw a line between Spatsizi and Adzaidza, create a Tahltan tribal traditional reserve or park or whatever you want to call it, which is what they've called for themselves, and in doing so create the most remarkable protected area in all of Canada. And to do that, we will just have to overcome the resistance of the smaller entities, such as Imperial Metals, that has so much on the line personally, because they don't have the latitude of a Shell, and they have invested. They'll have to be compensated, but I don't think the future of our country should be held hostage to the corporate and personal financial ambitions of what is essentially a company of 7 men. I mean, Imperial Metals is the 75th biggest mining company in the country. It's small potatoes. It's 6 or 7 guys who got a lucky score when they bought the property from the previous company, BC Metals, that was just simply trying to push it as a stock move. And don't forget that this mountain is going to be ground up. The ore will not be smelted in British Columbia. It's going to be shipped out raw to Asian markets. So we're going to literally chew up one of our iconic mountains in order to simply send rock dust over to China. And we're going to do that for the generation of 200 jobs. I think the 3 things I'd say, well, this is Deidre, she's my publicity maven. I mean, my problem is I'm just a writer.
I think Forest Ethics has got a program going. We have some cards we'll bring out to the table.
Oh, sorry, Forest Ethics is not here, unfortunately, but they do have a program, and we'll bring out their cards. We just have them back. We're saying go and bear witness. I mean, there's tour operators in this area that are doing fabulous things, and if you can get up there, I think the more we create a tourism destination like we have in Haida Gwaii, the better. That's my background. But again, buy the book. All the royalties.
Write the MLAs. Write the
MLAs.
Write the ministers, and don't just send emails because they can be deleted. Send letters, phone, and just let people know that the world's watching. I mean, that's the most important thing we can do, that the people of British Columbia are aware of the situation. I mean, I'm no campaigner, but it seems to me that's how all these campaigns start, is when people, one by one, tell each other this is going on, and we cannot let this happen.
Paul?
And there's specific websites, you know, you can, like my website, daviswade.com, has an active blog. There's www.sacredheadwaters.com, you know, and Forest Ethics has its own website, and you know, so you can keep informed by this, but largely just, you know, spread the word and do what we've done all through British Columbia history when we've stood up for our rights in our country.
Thank you so much. What a wonderfully enriching conversation to bear witness to, and just to see the imagery on the screen is, as it carries with it its own kind of humility as well. So on behalf of the Royal Roads community, we just wanted to take a moment to thank you, and also to present you with a little token of our appreciation as well.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.